Seoul. 1:15 a.m., 9 days after the chairman's funeral. The rain hadn't let up all week, as though the city couldn't decide whether to grieve along with the family or simply wash everything clean. In the west wing of the Joo estate, behind a study door no one had touched since the old man died, a flashlight beam swept slowly across a wall of family photographs. Ada Okoye stood frozen in the hallway and watched two men in dark raincoats kneel in front of her late adoptive father's wall safe, gloved hands working the dial with a patience that meant they'd done this before. She should have run for the staff quarters and screamed the house awake. Instead, she stepped into the doorway. Looking for something? One man spun, flashlight swinging straight into her eyes. The second was already moving. Not toward the door, toward her. When a hand closed hard around her shoulder from behind and yanked her backward into the hall. "What did you take?" Joo Si-woo's voice was low and furious in her ear, his grip bruising. He'd heard the noise from his own room and come expecting to catch her exactly where he'd always believed she'd end up, going through their father's things the moment he was cold in the ground. "There's two men in there with a safe cracker." Ada hissed back, twisting free. "Does that sound like me to you?" It was the flashlight beam swinging wildly across both their faces that finally convinced him. The first man lunged, shoving past Ada toward the corridor. She threw an arm out and caught him across the throat hard enough to send him stumbling into a side table, glass shattering. Si-woo went for the second, 20 years of expensive taekwondo lessons finally useful for something other than competition trophies, and drove him back against the study door long enough for Ada to dive past both of them toward the open safe. There wasn't time to take everything. A leather-bound logbook, waterlogged with age, sat half out of the second man's jacket as he scrambled past her. She grabbed for it and got only the loose pages that spilled free, along with a slim diary tucked behind where the logbook had been. He wrenched the logbook back out of her hands and bolted, his partner already 3 strides ahead down the service stairs. By the time house security flooded the hallway, the men were gone over the garden wall, the logbook with them. What was left was a handful of loose pages, a small water-damaged diary with no name on the cover, and 2 adopted by hate siblings standing in the wreckage of their father's study, breathing hard, neither willing to ask the other what they'd actually seen. "Why were you really in here?" Si-woo asked again, quieter now. Ada looked down at the diary in her hands. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I don't think it was an accident that they wanted whatever was in that safe before the will reading." Neither of them could have guessed how right she was, or how much it would cost both families before the year was out. Ada Okoye had been 4 years old and nameless in any language anyone in Seoul could pronounce when Joo Han-se's company jet brought her home from Lagos, flashbulbs waiting on the tarmac. The press release called it humanitarian. Chairman Joo adopts war-orphaned girl, pledges new era of corporate compassion. It ran above the fold for a week, and for years afterward strangers on the street would stop her mother to say how generous the family was, how lucky the girl must feel, as though gratitude were a debt Ada had been born already owing. What none of those strangers saw was the Joo family's 7-year-old son standing at the bottom of the stairs that first night, staring at the stranger his parents introduced as his new sister, deciding, in the absolute certainty only a child is capable of, that she had come to take something from him. He didn't have a word for it yet. He spent the next 2 decades finding 1.20 years hadn't cured Si-woo of that certainty. He'd watched her get the same education, the same name on the family registry, the same seat at every formal dinner, and watched his father's eyes follow her business instincts with an attention they'd never once given his own. He called it favoritism out loud more than once. He never let himself call it love, not even when it so plainly was. Madam Joo had never explained, not really, why a humanitarian gesture had specifically been her, out of an entire orphanage of children that year. When Ada was small enough to still ask, her mother would only say, "You were chosen, that's all that matters," in a voice that closed the subject more firmly than any door, and a look in her eyes that Ada, even as a child, had learned not to push past. Chairman Joo Han-se had been sick for the better part of a year before his heart finally gave out in his sleep, leaving behind a company worth more than the GDP of several small nations, and a will that his longtime legal counsel, Director Han Jun-suk, insisted would be read exactly 1 week after the funeral, no earlier. Han had drafted that will personally twice over the chairman's final 2 months, and burned an early draft of his own in private the night he learned what the second version actually said. What it said, when the family finally gathered in the chairman's lawyer's office 9 days after the funeral, stopped every conversation cold. Madam Joo sat with both hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale before the recording even started. 65% of Joo Group's controlling shares, the chairman's voice read aloud from a recording he'd made before he died, would pass not to his son, but to Adana Okoye Joo, along with a sealed letter to be opened by her alone. Si-woo was on his feet before the recording finished. "She isn't even blood." "No," Han said carefully, watching Ada's face rather than Si-woo's. "Which is exactly the problem the board charter doesn't allow for. Joo Group's founding charter, drafted by Siwoo's great-grandfather in a different, more paranoid century, contained a clause no one outside the legal department had thought about in decades. Controlling shares could only rest with a blood descendant or a spouse of one. Anyone else holding them for longer than a year would trigger an automatic board vote to dissolve family control entirely, opening the company to the first hostile bidder with enough cash. The chairman, it turned out, had known about the clause when he wrote the will. He hadn't fixed it. He'd left it standing, deliberately, like a door he wanted someone else to choose whether to walk through. "You have 1 year," Han told the room, in the tone of a man delivering very bad news to absolutely no one's relief but his own. "To either contest this will or solve a problem your father apparently thought was romantic." Ada didn't open the sealed letter in front of anyone. She read it twice in the back of a taxi, hands shaking, then a third time alone in her room that night, the diary from the safe sitting unopened beside it like it knew it belonged to the same secret. Her father had written only 4 lines she could make any sense of. "I should have told you the truth years ago, and I was a coward instead. Ask your mother about Lagos 2004. Whatever she tells you, forgive her before you judge her. And forgive me, if you can, for choosing silence for 20 years instead of choosing you sooner." She had been born in 1999. Lagos 2004 meant nothing to her, except that it was clearly the year someone had decided her entire life would change shape forever, and no one had ever once mentioned it to her face. She had no idea yet that the answer was sitting 2 floors below her, in a locked filing room marked, in faded ink, simply, "Insurance Settlements, Closed Files." Han Joon-suk had spent 11 years making sure that filing rooms stayed closed. He'd been a junior counsel in 2004, present for every meeting that mattered, and had built his career on handling the Lagos situation so quietly that most of the current board didn't know there'd been a situation at all. A will that sent the chairman's adopted daughter digging through family history was the single worst thing that could happen to him before retirement. He didn't go to the men who'd broken into the safe to apologize for their failure. He went to them to ask, calmly, what exactly Ada had managed to grab before they escaped with the logbook, and didn't like the honest answer nearly as much as the dishonest one he'd been hoping for. She didn't go to Siwoo first. 2 nights after the will reading, she slipped into the company archive on the 11th floor and found, before her nerve ran out, a single newspaper clipping filed under the wrong year. A brief item about a logistics incident at a Lagos port expansion in early 2004, casualty figures redacted by hand. She was photographing it on her phone when a guard's flashlight swept the next aisle, and she fled with only the photo and one confirmed fact. 2004 was real, not just 4 lines in a dying man's letter. She showed Siwoo the diary reluctantly. 3 nights later, both of them hunched over his father's old desk like the children they'd once technically been raised as. The handwriting was a young woman's. Neat, careful, occasionally smeared where something had clearly been cried onto the page. Half the entries were ordinary. A wedding, a difficult mother-in-law, the loneliness of marrying into a family that valued her mainly for the son she eventually produced. The entries from a 6-week stretch in early 2004 were torn out entirely, the missing pages leaving a ragged scar through the middle of the book. "Someone removed these on purpose," Ada said. "Recently, maybe. The tear's too clean to be 20 years old." Siwoo looked at the blank space for a long time. "My mother doesn't go in that study," he said finally. "She hasn't since the day father died." Neither of them said the obvious thing out loud, that the only other person with a key to that safe, besides the men who'd broken in, was the one person both of them had been raised to never, ever question. They found, in a box neither had been allowed to open as children, a photograph of the 2 of them asleep against each other on a long flight, the chairman's coat draped over both. Someone had written on the back, "The day we became a family I never planned for, and never once regretted." "I don't remember that flight," Siwoo said. "I do," Ada said quietly. "You called me Nuna for almost a year before you figured out I was younger." He laughed before he could stop himself, and for the first time since the will reading, the silence between them didn't feel like a weapon. Han moved on 2 fronts at once. Quietly, he fed a friendly journalist a story about concerns within the family over the adopted daughter's sudden inheritance. Nothing libelous, just enough doubt to sway a board vote later. Less quietly, someone let themselves into Ada's room while she was at a dinner and searched every drawer, every floorboard, looking for a diary she'd already moved into a safety deposit box under a different name. She came home to a room that looked untouched, until she noticed the flight photograph turned face down on her desk instead of propped upright. Whoever had been there wanted her to know they'd been thorough and patient. The extended family did not take the news well. At a memorial dinner, an aunt wondered aloud, within Ada's hearing, whether the girl had influenced the chairman during his final illness. Siwoo, who'd said nothing in her defense at the will reading, surprised no one more than himself by standing up this time. "She has an MBA from the program I dropped out of twice," he said. and caught a costing error last quarter that saved us $4 million. Check your own judgment before you question hers. It wasn't an apology. It also wasn't nothing, and Ada noticed it had come from him without her having to ask. The loose pages they had managed to save from the logbook turned out to be a partial crew roster from a Joo Group port expansion project in Lagos. Dated early 2004, 12 names, half of them now dead, 3 retired and untraceable, and 1, Baek Sung-ho, still listed as living in a small coastal town 3 hours from Seoul according to the company's old pension records. They drove out together the following weekend, telling no one where they were going. Somewhere past the second toll booth, Ada realized they hadn't argued once in almost 3 hours, a record for the two of them since childhood. They found Baek Sung-ho's address exactly where the record said it would be, until they arrived at his door to find it standing open. His small house disturbed in the same careful, thorough way Ada's room had been the week before, and the old man himself nowhere in sight. It was Si-woo who spotted him first, 2 streets over, being half-walked, half-dragged toward a parked car by 2 men in dark coats Ada recognized immediately from the study. She didn't think. She floored the rental car's accelerator and laid on the horn, swerving close enough that one of the men had to release his grip on Baek's arm to throw himself out of the way, and Si-woo was already out the passenger door and running before the car had fully stopped. It wasn't a clean rescue. One of the men got a fist into Si-woo's jaw before Baek himself, 81 years old and apparently unwilling to be kidnapped quietly, swung his cane hard enough across the man's knee to buy everyone the half-second they needed to pile into the rental car and pull away, tires screaming, the second man's hand slapping uselessly against the trunk as they sped past him. They didn't take Baek home. They took him somewhere safer instead, a quiet borrowed house an hour outside the city, with a locked gate and a neighbor Si-woo trusted to call if anyone unfamiliar came asking questions. Baek Sung-ho's hands shook around a cup of tea before he could make himself speak. There was a dock collapse, he said finally. Overloaded against every safety report I personally filed that year. 11 port workers died. Madam Joo was pregnant with you, sir. He nodded at Si-woo. And visiting the site against everyone's advice, when it happened, she held one of the women as she died. A woman who had a daughter at home, for years old. No other family left alive to claim her. Ada sat very still. Me. The company paid every family a settlement on the condition they sign away any further claim and never speak to press. Baek went on. Madam Joo wasn't satisfied with money. She came to the chairman herself, weeks later, and asked him to bring the girl home, not as a donation to the company's image, though Director Han's predecessor made sure it was sold to the press exactly that way. She wanted to raise the daughter of the woman she'd watched die in her arms. The chairman agreed on one condition. That the real reason never reached the board, the press, or you, until he decided the time was right. He looked between them, ashamed. I kept the company's secret for 2 decades because I was afraid of losing my pension. I am more afraid now of dying with it. Han didn't know yet that Baek was safe, only that his men had failed to silence him, which was almost worse. It meant the old engineer was now a loose end with somewhere to talk. He moved up his timeline. Within days, an emergency board session was called, ostensibly to discuss governance concerns around the new heir. In practice, to push through a vote questioning her fitness to hold the shares at all, using the planted journalist's article as cover for doubts that several board members, genuinely unaware of the real history, found uncomfortably persuasive. Si-woo was asked to speak. Han had quietly suggested, days earlier, that supporting the vote would resolve everything. The company stayed in family hands, his hands, and the awkward sister problem solved itself. What none of them realized yet was that the board meeting Han had personally arranged to remove her was about to become the very room where his own secret finally ran out of places to hide. Si-woo stood up in front of the board that had watched him grow up, looked at Ada sitting alone at the end of the table for the first time since the will reading, and said the opposite of everything Han had spent a week preparing him to say. My father left this company to her because he trusted her judgment more than he trusted the both of us put together. Si-woo said, loud enough to reach the back of the room. And he was right to. I've spent 3 weeks trying to find a way to take that away from her. And the only thing I actually found was the truth about why she's here at all. He nodded to the door. Baek Sung-ho walked in on a cane, with Ada steadying his other arm, and told the entire board exactly what he told them 3 days earlier in a borrowed kitchen. The collapse, the settlement, the 4-year-old girl with no family left, the chairman's quiet, decades-long bargain to make it right without ever admitting why. The room that had been ready to vote Ada out 40 minutes earlier sat in absolute silence. Instead it was Madam Joo, standing unannounced in the doorway behind Baek, who finally broke it. No one had told her about the meeting. She'd come anyway, the missing diary pages, 6 of them, folded into quarters, clutched in one hand. I tore these out the night my husband died, she said. I told myself I was protecting the company. I think now I was only protecting myself from finally finishing the sentence I started writing 20 years ago. She crossed the room and pressed the pages into Ada's hands instead of reading them aloud. I held your mother while she died, and I have spent every day since trying to deserve having taken her place in your life instead of simply earning it. I am sorry it took this long, and a stranger's funeral, to finally say so. Han Jun-suk didn't wait for the vote that would now obviously go against every plan he'd built. He was already moving toward the side door, the recovered logbook, quietly retrieved from the safecrackers days earlier and kept in his own office as insurance, tucked under one arm when building security, alerted by Si-woo before the meeting even started, blocked the corridor ahead of him. He didn't run so much as he simply stopped, the way a man stops when he finally does the math and realizes he has nowhere left to go. He set the logbook down on the nearest table himself, the same table the original settlement files had been signed at decades earlier, and didn't say a single word as security walked him out past the board he'd spent 30 years protecting from a truth that, in the end, protected itself. Madam Joo found Ada 2 nights later, not in the study this time but in the garden, where Ada had taken to sitting most evenings since the will reading. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Madam Joo sat down on the cold stone bench anyway, careful of her knees, and said, "Your mother's name was Adiz. I only learned it the week before the funeral, the proper one, the one the company never let the families hold in public. I have known it for 20 years and never once said it out loud to you, because I was afraid that if I did, I would have to explain everything else along with it." "Say it again," Ada said. "Adiz," her mother said, and this time her voice didn't close the subject. It opened it finally all the way 20 years late and still somehow not too late at all. The board vote, when it finally happened, wasn't close. Ada kept her shares. Han Jun-suk didn't keep his pension, his reputation, or, within the year, his freedom once prosecutors finished cross-referencing 30 years of settlement files he'd hoped no one would ever read again. The company's first public act under its new majority shareholder was a foundation that found and properly compensated every family from the 2004 collapse still living, including, finally, an apology that used real names instead of legal language. As for the clause that had started the whole frantic year, nobody in the family brought it up again until Si-woo did, on a quiet evening 11 months later, on the same coastline where they'd once hidden an old man with a secret worth protecting. "We don't share a single drop of blood," he said. "I checked. I made my lawyer check twice, just to be sure I wasn't about to do something legally insane. And," Ada asked, "and I'd still like to marry you. Not because of a 100-year-old clause my great-grandfather wrote to keep strangers out. Because I spent 20 years calling you a stranger. And I would like the rest of my life to make up for getting that so completely wrong." She didn't answer with a yes right away. She answered by reminding him, the way she had 100 times since they were children sharing one airplane coat, that he still owed her an apology for every birthday he'd ruined before the age of 15, and that he could start paying that debt back immediately, starting with this one. Some families are built on blood. Theirs was built on a debt no one had the courage to name for 20 years, and on two people who finally chose, instead of inherited, each other. If this story had you hooked, tell us in the comments. Should Madam Joo have told the truth 20 years sooner, or do you understand why she waited?